So I just want to say welcome, everybody, and I want to make a couple quick announcement before we get started. On April 20th, we're going to have Timothy Gerard speak about thematic maps in R. He's going to be talking about the map SF package and creating thematic cartography styles in R. So I hope you're looking forward to that, and I hope you'll join us for that event. And I just wanted to introduce our speaker, Carson Sievert, today. Carson is a software engineer on the Shiny team at Posit. He joined Posit in 2018 and in recent years has focused primarily on Shiny for Python and improving Shiny UI. The Shiny UI work has manifested in the creation and the development of many R packages, such as bslib, thematic, HTML tools, HTML widgets, Sass, Shiny, R Markdown, flexdashboard, and more. Carson also has a PhD in statistics and is a recipient of the American Statistical Association's Chambers Statistical Software Award, has maintained the R package Plotly since 2015, authored the book Interactive Data Visualization with R, Plotly, and Shiny, and ran a successful freelance consulting service for numerous years. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Carson.
Great. Well, thank you, Christian. I probably would have made a shorter bio if I knew you were going to read it, but thanks for that. So before I get started, I do want to highlight the fact that I have a link here, bit.ly/bslib-dashboard-slides. So if you go to that link, you will be directed to the slides that I'm looking at here. There will eventually be a link to a Posit Cloud project that, like later in the talk, I'll be walking through like an interactive demo with R code. And some of the stuff I'm going to be showing is still in development. So I wanted to make sure that I provided like a reproducible computing environment where you could run this code and get the same results if you're interested. And also I should probably start out by apologizing a little bit if the title of this talk makes it sound a little bit more profound than what I'm actually going to talk about today. Probably a more suitable title would be How to Make a Dashboard with bslib. But I didn't start actually making the slides for this until a few days ago, so I just kind of like left it pretty generic, and now I have a better idea of what we're actually going to talk about today. All right, so if you haven't heard of bslib before, this is a fairly new R package that Shiny itself depends upon, at least recent versions of Shiny. And the name bslib comes from this open source project called Bootstrap. And if you've ever kind of created a web page from the ground up, you're probably already familiar with Bootstrap. It's just one of the most popular open source web development projects of the last decade or so. And many web pages still nowadays use Bootstrap, including Shiny. So from the very get-go, with Shiny, which was introduced more than 10 years ago, has always depended pretty heavily and is bound pretty tightly to this Bootstrap dependency. And for pretty complicated technical reasons, at least for the near-term future, Shiny is likely going to continue defaulting to Bootstrap 3, which was released 10 years ago. And the reason we do this in a nutshell is basically like Shiny cares a lot about backwards compatibility. So we want you to be able to update to a new version of Shiny without breaking anything in your app that you wrote 10 years ago. So basically our way of making it easy for you to opt into a newer version of Bootstrap is through this bslib package. So kind of like the first main priority for this bslib package, which has kind of been the focus for the last year or two, is to allow you to use any like modern version of Bootstrap And not only that, but also easily customize the CSS that Bootstrap is providing. So this is, as we're going to see a little bit later, we're going to talk a little bit about custom theming with bslib. And the way that it does this is by customizing the CSS that comes with Bootstrap. Now, the scope of this bslib project in kind of more recently, maybe like the past year or so, we've been kind of steadily increasing the scope of this project and thinking about it as just a more, a new place for us to build out like a more modern UI toolkit that can replace some of these UI tools in Shiny and other projects like Shiny Dashboard that at this point feel pretty outdated, and we would like to, give you some fresher, more modern looking replacements. So as of today, this currently includes like some page and layout helpers. We've just added sidebar layouts. Sidebars are not currently on CRAN, so you have to get that from GitHub. But we've also shipped things like cards and value boxes. Accordions is coming in the new version, and there's some other stuff in there as well. So that's really going to kind of be the heart of the talk today, is to cover kind of these components and how we can use them to build dashboards. But the work here is certainly not done. Eventually we would like to get to like, maybe replacements for some of Shiny UI's inputs, or like newer alternatives that do certain things better. Also things like make it easier for you to add tooltips to things, or show busy indication when your plot or some output is currently recalculating, and other stuff like that. And some of this work is already underway, but as we kind of go through this process of kind of slowly adding in just a new UI toolkit, we plan on integrating this work with Shiny for Python and also the Shiny UI editor. If you haven't seen the Shiny UI editor, I recommend Googling for it. I also have a link here to the project website. The goal here is to provide like a drag and drop experience for building Shiny UI. Shiny, I haven't actually said what UI means. If you don't know what UI means, it stands for user interface. So it's kind of like almost like a Tableau or like graphical user interface approach to choosing from inputs and outputs and layout utilities, and kind of dragging and dropping that into a thing that you can then, rearrange the look of things and get code back out to reproduce what you've done by dragging and dropping. And to jump right into it, the sort of simplest way you can start using bslib is to use its drop-in replacements for Shinies. Like you might be familiar with fluid page or fixed page or navbar page. These are kind of the ways, the classic ways that you would create a page container for your Shiny UI. And so bslib provides these drop-in replacements where you can already start to see with the naming convention here with page fluid, where bslib also kind of takes the opportunity to leverage things like autocomplete, where instead of having page as the suffix to the function name, you can just type in page underscore and then tab and see all the different page options in bslib. So we kind of embrace this idea of autocomplete, as well as snake case instead of camel case naming. Right. So yeah, right here, I'm just using page fluid. And by doing this, bslib is going to give me the latest version of Bootstrap, which is currently Bootstrap 5. And then I'm going to use this H1 to create a level 1 header, and then I would get a result like this on the right. All right, so these page containers currently default to Bootstrap 5, but just like how Shiny is a work in progress, Bootstrap is a work in progress. So I think they're currently working on Bootstrap 6. So we reserve the right to basically change what you get by default with bslib. And we do this through the theme argument. Shiny's page containers also contain this theme argument. And in Shiny, this argument actually defaults to null. But in bslib, we default this to this bstheme object here. So this bstheme function call gives you access to all sorts of different controls, mainly around theming. But one other thing that it does is it gives you control over the version of Bootstrap. So if you're actually using bslib in production, it's recommended that you hard code this version, because in the future we could potentially upgrade the default version of Bootstrap, and this will kind of minimize any risk in newer versions, changing like the look and feel or even breaking your application. And you might already be familiar with the fact that there's other R packages that have been around for a long time, like Shiny themes that allow you to pick from, like, there's about like a dozen or so prepackaged themes that come from this project called Bootswatch. So for each version of Bootstrap, Bootswatch comes out with new themes for each version of Bootstrap. So if you're to upgrade to Bootstrap 5, you would get access to some new themes that you probably haven't seen before, like this quartz theme, which puts this crazy sort of color gradient background for a background color on your app. Now, if you have pretty specific needs for how you need to style your application, bstheme also gives you both high-level and low-level controls for theming at kind of the page level, where bstheme has this bg argument for background color and fg for foreground color. Also, some controls for kind of like the default font that gets used in a lot of different places. And if you've ever tried to use custom fonts before, you've probably found out that it's pretty difficult to actually use custom fonts, because to do it properly, you need to actually import the font files for those fonts to make sure that they render on the client's machine. So we've provided this font Google function that at least gives you access, allows you to really easily use Google fonts. And we'll do a bunch of magic behind the scenes to automatically download those font files if need be, put them in a local cache and import them, so that even if the end user doesn't have an internet connection, they're guaranteed to actually be able to render those fonts. And there are hundreds, I think maybe even thousands of theming variables that Bootstrap exposes through this interface. So just to give you one pretty specific example, there's a theming variable for changing the font size of level 1 headers. So I could change this to 5 rems, and now the size of this has basically about doubled. So that kind of in a nutshell is theming at the page level, but another kind of benefit of upgrading to a modern version of Bootstrap is that you can leverage this idea of utility classes, where Bootstrap provides kind of these rules for CSS classes that you can sprinkle on at kind of the component level, which can be really, really helpful for especially handling kind of tricky spacing and alignment issues where you need a specific component to be maybe centered or spaced in a little bit of a better way. And then also if you just need a specific header or component to have a different color or add borders or stuff like that, these utility classes can be really, really useful. All right, so that's really all I'm going to say about theming. And I would like to kind of do the heart of the talk today about what we've been working on more recently with the bslib components. And one of kind of the most foundational things, foundational components that we've added is this card API. So I've just listed card here, but there's about a handful of different functions for working with cards. And at a surface level, cards are pretty basic. You know, it's basically just the concept of having a border and some padding around some content and maybe like a header and a footer. But we've also kind of added in the ability to make cards full screen. Like if you wanted like multiple cards and the card is like a little bit too small laid against all the other cards, you have the ability to make it full screen. And also just kind of thought about this in a way that works well with these other components. So another thing that we've shipped in prior versions is this layout column wrap, which is kind of our new recommendation for doing multi-column layouts in a responsive way. It is possible to do, you know, multi-column layout with, you probably use fluid row and column from Shiny, but this is a little bit better for a case where you want essentially all of your UI elements to be the same width and fit into possibly like a responsive two-dimensional grid. And we'll see examples of this. As I mentioned, this is just currently in the development version, but we've added a sidebar and a sidebar layout. So this gives you a pretty flexible API for putting sidebar layouts in all sorts of different scenarios. And it also allows you to collapse that sidebar interactively. There's also like your classic value box, which maybe you've seen from like flexdashboard and Shiny dashboard, something pretty similar. Here available in bslib. Also something that maybe you haven't seen before is this idea of an accordion, where it's like multiple content panels where you can collapse different sections of that accordion. And there's also a much more complete grammar of navigation components. So you are maybe familiar with like navbar page from Shiny or tab set panel or tab panel from Shiny. There's a new kind of way to, a new way of expressing these things that allows you to handle things like right aligning navigation items, also adding in maybe like a search bar to a navbar page, stuff like that. And it also adds, as this bullet item highlights, like new variants on a tab set panel that are actually card based. So nav's tab card here is kind of like a tab set panel, but also wrapped up into a card. So it has like a border around everything and some padding. So, and if you kind of look at what is here holistically, that's basically all you really need to create a dashboard. So the vision here is a little bit more general than like, you know, we don't want to think about bslib as like just for making dashboards, but the point at which we're at right now feels like kind of a critical turning point where you can start to think about using bslib for creating a dashboard. All right, so let's actually build one. I have this link here. You probably don't want to actually follow along with me and just kind of watch what I'm doing. But if you have the link to the slides here, you'll be able to get to this link to Posit Cloud that has the same R script that I'm going to walk through, and an environment where that code will actually run for you. But I would also recommend, like, don't actually build something that you really need to like ship to production tomorrow, because this stuff is still a work in progress. And I would wait until the next CRAN release to actually, you know, build something that's serious and important with the stuff that I'm going to show you today. All right. So I'm going to open up this R script here in our studio, and we're going to load a few packages, most importantly, bslib and Shiny. I'm also going to use some other sort of optional packages here. And I'm also going to use this package called Crosstalk. That this stuff, basically Crosstalk is going to allow me to create kind of some drill down examples that are going to work well in sidebar layouts in such a way that I don't actually have to create Shiny apps for each example. So these are going to be like static web pages that are interactive, but there's no R code running in the background necessarily. And that's really just for convenience sake. And this first kind of chunk of setup code here, the details here are not so important in terms of like, you know, building a dashboard with bslib, because you'll be able to use these UI tools that we're going to get to eventually to, you know, you can use it really in any Shiny app. But just for convenience sake, I'm just going to use Crosstalk here and kind of hand wave the explanation here, but I'm going to use this diamonds data set that actually comes from ggplot2 and use this shared data thing to basically say, I want to be able to create both input controls with this data and also output views from this data and have the inputs and outputs talking to each other. So I'm going to create a list of filters here. So each one of these filters is basically a dropdown where I can choose from like values of a categorical variable. I'm going to create a list of Plotly visuals that are all basically like histograms or bar charts. And then I'm also going to do the same for, there's this data set that comes from Leaflet that has like the location and magnitude of earthquakes. So I'm going to do the same thing for that and create a map. And that's really just more so for later. But I want us to think about this, like, don't focus too much on the fact that I'm using Plotly here and I'm using Leaflet to create maps. I really want to talk about a lot of this stuff kind of generically, in the sense that, you know, you may have already, you probably hopefully already created Shiny apps, and maybe with something like Shiny plot output, or maybe a different HTML widget package other than Plotly, like maybe Bokeh or DT is another HTML widget, but specific for tables. And pretty much like all HTML widgets and, you know, Shiny outputs like plot outputs, they're going to default to a height of 400 pixels. So you might have created Shiny apps where you just kind of dump outputs into something like page fixed or page fluid. And each one of these outputs here is going to then render to a height of 400 pixels, right? So that should hopefully be fairly familiar to you. But bslib also kind of introduces this concept that we've had to sort of, what's the right word, like propagate out to these other projects like HTML widgets and Shiny, where it introduces this concept of a fillable container. And so there's another page container that bslib provides called page fillable. And this is going to create what we call a fillable container that matches its size to the browser window. And whenever fill items appear as a direct child of a fillable container, then those fill items are going to be allowed to grow and shrink with the size of that fillable container, right? So This is kind of an abstract concept that we'll be coming back to, like we'll be using in different ways, but this is kind of introducing the concept of a fillable container. In the case of page fillable, this fillable container will have a height matching the browser window, and then the fill items will be allowed to match, like be allowed to change their size to fit that size. Okay, and then I'm also going to be using some syntax like this. Erlang calls this a triple bang operator, where it allows you to what you might have heard the term splicing before, where it takes like a list of values and basically it's the equivalent of this code above here, where it takes each element of that list and passes it in as an argument to this function. So I'm just pointing out, like, this is the same thing as what I'm doing above. It's just a more concise way of writing that out. Okay. And then just to like make this a sticky note point, that I want us to kind of remember this terminology of a fill item is allowed to grow and shrink to fit a fillable container. So I'm kind of defining these terms: fill item, which should be a child of a fillable container. But the kind of nuance here is that to actually grow and shrink, these fill items require their immediate parent to be fillable and one of their parents to have a specified height. So in this case here, this is kind of like the most simple case, where at the page level, you have a fillable container. It has a specified height that matches the browser window. And then it just has 3 direct children that are fill items. All right, so once we kind of think about cards in this context of fillable containers and fill items, things already start to get a little bit nuanced. So let me run this code here and point out that cards by default, just like HTML widgets and plot output, they are also by default considered fill items. So the fact that this card is a fill item inside of a fillable container, that's going to make this card here, that I've outlined this card with a blue border here. That's what this utility class with a border primary is doing. It's giving me this blue border that is around this card, basically highlighting the fact that this card is a fill item filling this page because the page is fillable. And not only is a card a fill item by default, but it's also a fillable container. And you know, you don't necessarily have to have a card header with a card, but I just want to point out, like, inside of a fillable container like card, you could have items that are not fill, and then those things aren't allowed to grow and shrink. They're just going to basically render to their natural height. And then kind of like the main thing that, you know, all cards are going to have is a card body. And by default, a card body is a fill item. So the fact that it's a fill item is going to make sure that this red border here, I've added this border danger to give me this red border, is going to make sure that this body portion of the card actually fills the card fillable container. So that will just make sure that, like, the interior body portion is going to fill properly, but it is not a fillable container by default. So even though I have fill items inside of the body, these items are basically, we're going back to the situation of a page fixed scenario, where this is not a fillable container, and these are just items that have a default height of 400 pixels. So they're going to allow themselves to just render to their default natural height, and they're not going to try to grow and shrink to match that fillable container. Right? But so this is like basically the option of, I want a card body, but I want to allow things to be scrollable inside of this card body, right? And that might not necessarily be the layout that you want to implement. So you could also change this card body to a card body fillable, which will make that body a fillable container, allowing these fill items to actually fill its parent. So in this case, since the card body is a fillable container and it's matching the cards size, the plots are, again, going to be allowed to grow and shrink to match that fillable container. Right. So again, to highlight the difference here, the card body was not a fillable container. So the fill items inside of that card body are not growing and shrinking. They're just staying their default height. And if they overflow, I can scroll. But here they're going to try to fit the size of the parent and grow and shrink with the size of that parent. Right. So this stuff is like, a little bit hard to wrap your head around, especially initially coming to this stuff. And you might wonder, why are we kind of allowing you to have such low-level control of like, what's a fill item, what's a fillable container, and why can I match the two? And really the main purpose of this is we want to enable you to do something like have full screen cards, even in a context where you're not filling this window. Like I just have a page fixed, so I'm allowed to scroll at the page level. But then I can have at the component level, something like this, where if I go into this card, I might want to utilize this full screen feature where I click expand on this card. And now the card will then match the size of the window. But because I do not have a fillable container here for the card body, this fill item of the plot inside of this card body is not basically being given the permission to grow and shrink to match its parent's container. So, but I can change that in the second card here. This is basically the same card. The only difference is card body fillable instead of card body. Now, if I expand that one, the plot will actually grow to match its parent's container. Right. So questions so far are at this point, is this kind of sinking in for people?
I'm just super impressed. Like I feel like these expandable cards are going to be so useful, because a major difficulty with Shiny, at least in my experience, my working with it, has been like, oh, how do I get it to fit on the page? And you want to put more and more visualizations in, but then they're so cramped, right?
Yeah.
Well, these expandable cards will really help me. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And I think it'll especially help. We'll see some examples of this where I think, people really like to kind of reach for this kind of filling layout, especially because stuff like Flex Dashboard has made this kind of popular, where you can pretty easily say, like, I want a layout that will grow and shrink to match the browser window. But if you have a lot of stuff going into that filling layout, as you increase the amount of stuff, the space is going to get smaller and smaller as you're trying to fit this window. So kind of combining the two of like, have a filling layout, but then also allow people to expand the size of things, I think can be quite powerful.
I just wanted to say, Todd said he didn't quite catch the difference between the two cards, so you might want to show them one more time.
Okay, so in this code chunk here, is this yeah, so the only difference here, like, so here's card one. I guess that these are actually showing different, like these are showing diamond carrots and this one's showing diamond price. But really the important difference here is here I was just using card body, which does not give its children the potential to fill the card body. But with the card body fillable, that gives this plot basically gives its children permission to fill its size. So
I guess I missed what the difference was visually. You click that expand on the
Oh.
diamond carrot.
yeah,
How is it not
so
filling? Oh, vertically.
yeah, so vertically it does not fill.
And the
so
other
if I
one,
make this,
this
let
is
me just make this smaller to also like highlight. If I make this really small, it's still the plot's still gonna render to 400 pixels, but now I have to scroll to see the full plot.
interesting.
But then the second one here, this is a card body fillable. This will grow and shrink to, really there's no limits on how small or large you can make this. There are arguments to card body fillable if you do want to put some conditions on how small or large it can get. But that's still something that I don't feel like we've solved at kind of a general level yet. So that's something that might change in the future, or like, you know, we might add some functionality around that. So
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm basically going to wrap this concept of having a card. I'm also going to add this BG dark to the header just to make a dark header, just for styling. And make sure to wrap basically the plot that I'm going to give this function into card body fillable and make sure it's a full screen card. So let's define this helper function. And then I'm just going to wrap each 3 of these histograms of Plotly visuals. And I also want to just highlight the fact that when you're working with things like cards in bslib, we've actually, in an attempt to kind of improve the development experience, if you've ever like, you know, worked with, I don't know, like column in Shiny, when you print these things at the console, it just shows you the HTML that this component would then, you know, put into the actual website that you'll create. But in bslib, we'll basically automatically like wrap this up into a page container and give you a preview, because that's probably what you actually want to look at first. So just pointing out, like you could take a card, print it out the console, and then like make sure that this is actually like doing what you want it to do. Right, and then as I had mentioned, this layout column wrap is kind of like our new recommendation, especially if you want to work with these filling layouts to create multi-column layouts. So this is a pretty like the most basic way you can use this function is to give it a number between 0 and 1, probably expressed as like 1 divided by some number. And you can think of this as like the number in the denominator is the number of columns that you want to create with this layout. So here, by giving this a width of 1/2, I'm basically saying give this plot price half width, caret half width. And then since, again, just like cards, this component here is considered a fill item by default and creates fillable containers around each element. It also has this property of when it appears in a fillable container, it will be allowed to grow and shrink with the size of that container. So not only do these cards grow and shrink with the size of this browser window here, but I also have the full screen ability on each one of these cards. Okay, so yeah, I still have quite a bit to show, so I'm going to kind of try to get through as much of this as I can. So here I'm just going to basically save the results of this layout column wrap into an object called histograms. And then I'm going to feed this into a sidebar layout. So same start where I have a page fillable container. And then I'm going to take a layout sidebar, which again is a fill item. And the first argument to layout sidebar is going to want a sidebar object. So the sidebar object here, you can customize things like the background of the sidebar, other things like positioning of the sidebar and stuff like that. And then for the other arguments to this layout sidebar, I can basically kind of give it main content to show in this sidebar layout. So I'm going to run that, and this is the result here. So again, since this layout sidebar is a fill item, we're going to get kind of this layout container for the sidebar filling the page, so that even if I make the window small or large, I'm still going to get this sidebar layout container, which has this little collapse toggle towards the bottom of this sidebar layout. Is always going to be kind of positioned at the bottom of that layout container. This will make sure that basically the way the positioning on this thing works, by making sure the container fits the window, this will always be positioned towards the bottom here. And just to demonstrate like what would actually happen if you didn't have a fillable container, say this is now page fix instead, you're going to get something quite different, where the page fixed will restrict the maximum width. So this, you're now going to have some padding around this layout sidebar. And then these things, since I've kind of broken this rule of a fillable container with a specified height, these things are now going to render to their natural height and basically, go as long as they need to go to show the default height here. So I wouldn't recommend doing something like this, but just demonstrating what would happen if I used a different page layout. Now, also want to point out here that I've also added this fillable equal to true argument. The reason we need this kind of as an argument to layout sidebar is I haven't actually wrapped this main content area up into an actual container. So there's kind of an implicit container going on for the main content area. And this fillable equal to true allows me to treat that as a fillable container. So if I take this off and basically give me the default behavior of layout sidebar, we're going to allow the main content area to scroll. So I still have a fillable page and a layout sidebar that's filling that page. So I still have this layout container filling the page, but since the main content area is not saying please make these children fit my current size, going to allow it to basically overflow its container, which I can then scroll to get at the contents inside of that. Okay, and yeah, so I think that's all I wanted to say there. And I also want to highlight the fact that dashboarding frameworks have really kind of popularized this idea of having a global sidebar, which may end up actually being a pretty bad UX if you have multiple sections of grouped, say one group of content towards the top, but then another group of content towards the bottom. And these things don't really share input controls. Typically, I would say this kind of experience is fine, basically because I haven't actually showed you the fact that, let me make this fillable so you can see it all at the same time, but these are input controls that will allow me to filter down on each one of these visuals here. So all of these inputs that I put into the sidebar are all having an effect on the data that I'm showing in the main content area. So in general, this is kind of like a fine UX thing to do where, you know, there isn't kind of like content floating in space where it's not clear like what inputs are affecting which outputs kind of thing. So to give you an idea of where this kind of falls down, like if I wanted to then put another output towards the bottom here with the map of this earthquakes data, which has nothing to do with the diamonds data set, this would be an example of like this bad UX where these input controls only affect the top 2 rows of outputs, and this map at the bottom is not related to these input controls. Now, one thing I could do pretty quickly and easily here is to just pull out this map outside of the layout sidebar. I'm also going to remove this padding 0 on the page fillable. And now I've actually like at least have decent groupings of these outputs where I kind of have, you know, a border and some padding around just the diamonds information at the top here. And then I've kind of visually separated that out from the map card at the bottom. So that's an improvement, but it's still not quite like a great, you know, obviously it's not like an ideal way to lay out this information. So if you're in this situation, and especially like another useful thing that kind of fits into this idea of bringing the input controls closer to the content that it affects, a tip to keep in mind is that a layout sidebar integrates nicely with a card. So I can just kind of plop this layout sidebar inside of a card. And now I have this card with a map inside of it. I've also created a sidebar in this case that by default is not open, since maybe you don't want to show like all these input controls that might affect some output, all, you know, try to stuff a bunch of things inside of this card that's all shown by default. But now I have this kind of like drawer capability of opening some additional filtering controls like this. And this sidebar function, you can also like change the positioning. If you wanted like a right position sidebar, you can also do something like that. So yeah, so let's kind of bring this all together now, where I'm going to basically just recreate this layout sidebar with the diamonds data here. And I'm going to save that as basically a page to feed into this page navbar. And then also like so that I can basically create a page that's dedicated to diamonds. I'm also going to leverage, there's this fillable argument on page navbar where you can choose which pages you want to be fillable containers or not. So I could have like this first page be kind of, you know, like your classic, sorry, I got to get another browser here to give you a proper preview. So kind of like your classic shiny dashboard look with a fillable page as well. But then I could go on this other page and just like kind of have maybe one card or multiple cards floating in space. Maybe they're scrollable, that each has their own kind of dedicated sidebar layout inside of each card. All right. You can also, this is probably, you know, getting maybe too far into the weeds, but also just wanted to mention, you can also take a singular sidebar object and feed it to an argument of page navbar. And then that sidebar will be shown on every page. So if you are in this situation of, I truly do want a sidebar that gets shown on every page because all the outputs on these different pages get influenced by these input controls, then we do allow for that as well. I would say in this situation, maybe it would make sense to, instead of like creating a page navbar, maybe this is something that wants to be like embedded inside of a larger page. In that case, you can basically just change page navbar to nav's tab card. And now I have essentially the same experience, but now inside of a card that I could plop inside of a larger page. And again, since I've provided the sidebar object to this sidebar argument, instead of embedding it inside of a specific page, then this sidebar gets shared across all the tabs. I'm actually, maybe, let's see how much else. I'm probably, I mainly want to skip this, but I just want to mention, if you're in this situation, maybe you do want to like hide and show certain filters depending on which page is active. You can use like Shiny's conditional panel. Maybe you've used this before, like with Shiny Dashboard. You can basically do the same thing here as what you probably have done in Shiny Dashboard to change what's in the sidebar depending on which page is active. So real quickly, try to cover value boxes. So there's kind of like, you know, if you've seen Flex Dashboard or Shiny Dashboard value boxes, there's kind of a similar interface here. I would say the one that we have in bslib is a little bit more flexible in general. So if you wanted to, you could also put content like below the values here. There's this like pretty general showcase argument is where I'm providing these icons, but you could provide really any HTML like value that you wanted to. So I do have examples in this link here of like doing this kind of crazy thing of like putting a plotly graph inside of that showcase area and then leveraging the full screen capability to like make it like basically like imagine like a time series that appears like a little spark line, but then becomes larger when you make it full screen. Also, these accordion components, you can drop them into a sidebar. So if you have like groups of input controls that you want to basically, you know, not only really like just show you maybe one or two sections of input controls by default, but also just kind of semantically group inputs that are related to each other. You can use this accordion feature, and then people can like show and hide groups of input controls. But also accordion is like pretty general, where you might want to just like even put this into the main content area of a layout sidebar and just have like lots of, you know, descriptions about, you know, various aspects of your project. And then this is really the last example I wanted to show. But I also, this is not an official RStudio thing. This is a package I created, but there's also this package called Histo Slider that maybe instead of like a traditional slider input from Shiny, sometimes it can be a little bit nicer to actually have a histogram to go along with that slider to show like, you know, with this caret variable, most of the diamonds have like below 1 caret. But if you filter on like 1 or more carets, like obviously the price increases quite a lot on diamonds versus, you know, if you're consider the entire distribution of diamonds. All right, phew. I think we only have a few minutes. Is that correct?
You can take as much time as you need.
Okay.
Yeah, if you need to wrap up, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, it's really just a couple minutes of me just summarizing what all of this means. So in summary, I just basically want to say, like, we feel like it's time for you to consider using bslib for your next dashboard. It's still very much a work in progress. Like, it's not even on CRAN yet. A lot of the stuff that I've shown, notably the sidebar layout stuff. And obviously with this fillable fill API, there's a much steeper learning curve than Shiny Dashboard and Flex Dashboard. And I'm not gonna lie, like, it's pretty easy for like the conditions of which like these things actually work can break down pretty easily. But hopefully we document that well, and it'll be more or less pretty intuitive for you to do kind of the basic things well. And once you actually kind of, some of this stuff starts to sink in, you'll be working in a framework that's much more themable, much more composable. So if you've ever like, obviously with the layout sidebar stuff is a good example of how like this layout sidebar thing is designed to be used in like a lot of different contexts, which is very different from like how Shiny Dashboard and Flex Dashboard are set up. And, you know, especially when it comes to like Flex Dashboard, the fact that you're working with these functional components that are just HTML underneath the hood, if you have the need to make these things like extensible or customize them and port them to different projects, it's a lot easier to do that when you're working with these functional components. So, but that being said, especially as of today, you may miss some Shiny Dashboard features if you use this project a lot. Probably one of the bigger things is Shiny Dashboard promotes this idea of putting navigation inside of the sidebar. So that usually ends up in like people kind of want to like step through like multiple things using the sidebar. And I would say in general, most of the time, this just feels like an anti-pattern to me. And I think we're going to try to push people in the direction of keeping navigation in the header. And if you want anything outside of that, then you should consider like keeping nav inside of like the cards, like the card-based tab, or like navigation list components. You can also kind of recreate the sidebar navigation kind of experience with navigation lists. And so I think there's room for us to like consider actually supporting this, but I think it's actually probably a higher priority for us to give you new and better ways to like make more scalable and better looking navigation components that are like in the header, like maybe a double nav bar or like a mega menu kind of experience where you can put like lots of groups of different pages all in one place. But as always, we like to hear, you know, how you're actually feeling about working with these tools. So if you have ideas for improvements or just want to tell us how you're using these things, we love to hear about that stuff. And also just want to, since we're, you know, I've kind of advertised this as making dashboards with bslib, just point out like not everything needs to be a dashboard necessarily, with that classic kind of fold lead sidebar and nav bar page. Sometimes you just kind of want like more of like an R Markdown experience with like scrolling content and paragraphs and interactives that people are allowed to scroll. So, you know, I sort of mentioned this in the fact that, you know, these components are kind of designed to be more generically useful than you might have traditionally thought about working with Shiny UI, where These components, for the most part, should work in like static sites or like a static R Markdown website. I don't think as of today you can really use these components in Quarto, but eventually that should be coming down the pipe. So hopefully you find these generally useful more than just dashboards. Just to reiterate, this stuff is in development, but hopefully in the next few weeks or so, we'll be doing a real release for all the stuff that you've seen today. So, and if you'd like to learn more, there's this bslib's home page is on rstudio.github.io/bslib. Expect a lot of documentation improvements coming to that website in the next few weeks. We're also hoping to kind of like incorporate some of this new bslib stuff on the like actual Shiny home site in the near future as well. But that's going to be coming later. But as of right now, in the next few months or so, this is going to be the place to kind of learn about bslib. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Carson. This has been amazing. I'm so excited to get into this and use these tools. I'm really excited about cards, especially. And I think it's just fantastic how you've improved on the sidebar experience, because my experience with using sidebars in Shiny has been you get one sidebar, that stays on the side across all of your pages. And to see how you've turned that into something that can be integrated into cards, into different nav sections is really great. And I think it's gonna, you were talking about like the ways that people have adopted anti-practices of putting stuff that shouldn't be in sidebars, or over relying on sidebars, or keeping sidebars the same across pages where they aren't as relevant. I think this is really going to fix a lot of those anti-practices that we see that, at least in my experience, we ended up doing because it was just the easiest, best solution that fit in the time frame we had. And so I think a lot of these tools are going to make a lot of Shiny apps that the developers don't have a lot of time to invest in look a lot better just really quickly. So I think that's going to be a huge boon for the community.
Yeah, sure hope so. And yeah, I don't really want to like advertise this stuff as necessarily going to be as easy as Shiny Dashboard. Like if you're on a short deadline, like maybe that's to get something real quick and easy, maybe like, you still reach for that. But once you get to the point of like, okay, I want to like make this thing more official and look better, like hopefully it's a smooth transition away from Shiny Dashboard and using something like bslib.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but I can hang around for a little while.
Sure.